Welcome to the Great Sources Season 2, Episode 19. Today's shir is called Do the Mitzvos Hatluyos Ba'aretz Pose an Insurmountable Challenge? Let's first review where we're up to in this series. We've completed the discussion of most of the subjects, most of the topics that we have to tackle. We've discussed the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael. We've discussed the Shavuos, the Shalosh Shavuos, how to apply them and what they mean. We discussed the fact that there is a decree of Galus, what that means for the mitzvah. And we've also discussed what to make of all the generations that didn't go to Eretz Yisrael, including the Bavliim. Last year we completed the discussion of the Tkufa of Bayis Sheni and the Machlokes Tina Birchen and Rish Lakish about whether all the Bavliim, had they returned, would have affected Hashras HaShechina. That's the end of that discussion. What we're on to today, we're on to the next stage, the next topic, or subtopic that we have to discuss in the sugya of living in Eretz Yisrael. And that is the question of the mitzvah tluyos ba'aretz and whether we are up to the challenge or whether in some way they pose a problem and some sort of ikov on us returning to Eretz Yisrael. This is going to be the subject of today's shir and one or perhaps two more. After that, we're going to be ready to talk about what the maskana is l'maisa, about what the halachah is about the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael. And after that, we're going to spend some shiurim discussing the idea of Eretz Yisrael, what it's all about, and how to live up to what it stands for, and what it's supposed to do to us. That will be the final shiurim. I want to also that's a summary of where we're up to and where we're going. I would like to remind those of you who haven't rated and reviewed the podcast to please do so. It is very helpful for getting these shiurim out there to more people who could benefit from them. So, today's discussion is the mitzvos hatluyos ba'aretz, the mitzvahs that have to do with agriculture in Eretz Yisrael, whether they pose a problem for us. And the source for this matter is a Taisus in Ksubas Daf Kuf Yudam and Beis, the shita of Rabbenu Chaim Kohen. Taisus quotes Rabbenu Chaim Kohen, and I want to read you the lashon. V'hoya omer Rabbenu Chaim, the achshav einoi mitzvah lodur be'Eretz Yisrael. The achshav einoi mitzvah lodur be'Eretz Yisrael. Now, it's not a mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael. Why? Ki yesh kama mitzvahs hatluyos ba'aretz ve'kama onshim de'ein anu yicholim nizar b'hem v'lamed aleim. Because there are many mitzvah hatluyos ba'aretz and many punishments that we're not able to be careful with v'lamed aleim and to fulfill or to get them right. So those are the words of Rabbenu Chaim in Tosfos. Now there is no mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael because there are many mitzvahs, many mitzvahs hatluyos ba'aretz, and many onshim that we're not able to be careful with and get them right. So Rabbenu Chaim is saying that now there is no mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael because we're not capable of living up to the challenge of the mitzvah hatluyos ba'aretz in the way that we're expected to, and not to get punished for transgressing them. So what we have to understand about Rabbenu Chaim Kohen, what we have to understand is, number one, what he means. Of course, what exactly he means. Well, number two, does he mean when Rabbenu Chaim Kohen said there's no mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael now, did he mean now in his time, specifically? 12th century, or did he mean is something unique about his tkufa, or did he mean now in a way that applies even perhaps today? And then the other thing we have to understand is this the halachah? So in order to approach this sugya of Rabbenu Chaim's shita about the mitzvah tluyas ba'aretz being a challenge that affects that there is no mitzvah, as he says, ain't a mitzvah, achshav ain't a mitzvah, we have to understand what he means, when he means it, and whether he's right, meaning is that the halacha. So the truth is you could even add a fourth question here, and that is, did Rabbenu Chaim Kohen say this? Because this is such a idea that there's no mitzvah b'zman hazeh is such a radical statement, and was so difficult to some of the achronim, so problematic to some of the achronim, that there are those who said that Rabbenu Chaim didn't write it, and it's a mistake. It's Agas Talmud. This is in Shalas Chuvas Marit in Yeridea. He brings a raya to this. He doesn't just say because it can't be. He brings a raya from the Mordechai. It doesn't matter to go into the raya, but the root of the matter is that the Marit holds this is so shver, this is so problematic to say for a Rishon to come and say there's no mitzvah because we can't be nizr mitzvah tlis ba'aretz. It's so shver. The Marit says in the Chidushim and Ksubis, he says it's divrei tema because there are many mitzvahs that we could keep. And why can't we be careful about the azharas? Why is there an inability to be nizar? So the Marit says that a Talmud Toya wrote it. It's not from Rabbenu Chaim, the great Rabbenu Chaim, the Talmud of Rabbenu Tam. It's not from him. It's from a Talmud Toya. Someone put this into Tais, it doesn't belong there. And the Marit ends in the Chidushim by saying, "Lest the chosh l'hader Rab Chaim." Nobody is worried about the shita of Rabbenu Chaim. No one considers it a shita l'halacha. In the Shalas Chuvas, he says, "Lav de samcha hi klal," and not only the Marit, but the Me'il Tzedakah, the great Chuvas say from Me'il Tzedakah, quotes the Marit saying, Marit says the Talmud Toy wrote it, and it's Lav de samcha hi klal, and he's right, and he quotes from the Sefer Nesivos Hamish, but also that the Tzagos is a Talmud, but it's not actually the Shita of Rabbenu Chaim. So, what did Rabbenu Chaim mean? Did he mean it for his time or for all times? Is the halacha like him? But really we can say, did he even say this? Because some people want to say he didn't say it. Which of course, I mean, without going into the evidence, it's in Taisvis, to suggest that he actually didn't say it is very, very shver. I'm just bringing that out to say, be'ikar, how problematic some Achronim consider this to be. Rabbi Yaakov Emdin, Nagoyas Yavitz on the Gemara, he says just the following comment on this Taisis. Shari le more, chas le meimer hachi, Poligmara Mishnu Gemara B'mili Dichadi Man Hadalei Chash Lekimche. May his master forgive him. Heaven forbid to say such a thing. He's arguing on a Mishnah and a Gemara with Mili Dichadi. Stam words he thinks that you can't be Mekayim the mitzvah, so there's no mitzvah anymore. Man Hadalei Chash Lekimche. Who is this person who's not careful about his output? Meaning Rabbenu Chaim is saying this thing just Stam. You want to say there's no mitzvah because you decided it's impossible to Mekayim mitzvahs. Well, it's not the way it works. You have his Mishnayos, Sugis, Seduris. That there is a mitzvah, and then you're going to say, oh, now it changed, you can't just do this. That's the problem of the Yavitz, that's how he expresses it. But I want to tell you that before we get to what Rabbenu Chaim means, and it actually makes a lot of sense, and there's no need to think it's so shver. The fact is, Daki Moshe in Yodeh, Daki Moshe brings down Rabbenu Chaim as a tzad. He doesn't say he holds like him, but he brings it as part of at least part of an argument as a tzad lahalacha. So, on the one hand, we'll talk about this in the end. We'll get back to what the halacha is, but in terms of just what Rabbenu Chaim Kohen said and whether he said it, and some people consider it so shver, there are many people that consider it very problematic, like Yaakov Emdin and the Marit and the Me'il Tzedakah and the Sefer Nesivos Hamishpat and others, but Daki Moshe does bring it. So just you should know where this fits in. The Beis Shmuel and Siman Ayin Hein Even Ezer also quotes this Rabbenu Chaim as one of the shitas. Okay. But we'll get to this in the end. We'll get to this about when we discuss whether the halachah of Rabbenu Chaim. We're going to get specifically who the halachah is like in this regard. But first, I want to explain. I want to get to the question of the Marit's question. What does Rabbenu Chaim Kohen mean? Why can't we be mekayim the mitzvah tluyas ba'aretz? Why can't we be careful? That's Marit's big problem. He says, I don't understand. What's Rabbenu Chaim Kohen saying? Why can't we do it? Why can't we be careful? Why can we not do that various? Now, before we get to answering that question, I just want to talk about what exactly Rabbenu Chaim is saying. he says literally that there's no mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael, Bizman has achshav now, because, says Rabbenu Chaim, because there are many mitzvahs, and many einshim that we can't be careful of. So what's the svara over here? What exactly is this svara? There's no mitzvah when we can't be mekayim mitzvah tluyas ba'aretz. Let me tell you what he's not saying. He's not saying that there's a mitzvah, but we can't do it because we're inevitably going to do averis. That's just not how he expresses it. He seems to be saying alumdus that the mitzvah is batal when we can't be mekayim the mitzvah tluyas ba'aretz. So I just want to state briefly what that could mean, and then we'll get to the Marit's question of why can't we be mekayim mitzvah tluyas ba'aretz. What exactly does Rabbenu Chaim mean? I want to just first talk about what the svara is exactly. There is no mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael when the mitzvah tluyas ba'aretz pose a challenge, a real challenge that we as lashon is ein anu yicholim lizar b'hem. We're not able to. So what does that mean? So now just to analyze it, either he holds like the Ramban that there is a mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael, a mitzvah say the Torah to live in Eretz Yisrael, but he holds that the mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael depends on the mitzvah tluyas ba'aretz. And if we're in a situation where we're not capable of being mekayim the mitzvahs that have to do with the land itself, with the Eretz, then there is no mitzvah to live in the Eretz. Or at least we shouldn't be transgressing the mitzvah tluyas ba'aretz. If we're not capable of keeping them, meaning we're going to be over on averis tluyas ba'aretz, in that situation there is no mitzvah. Or Rabbenu Chaim means that, not like the Ramban, that there's always a mitzvah. Again, the first side is always a mitzvah, but it depends on our ability to make kind of tzaltuis parts. Or Rabbenu Chaim Kohen holds that there is a mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael only at those times that Eretz Yisrael is given to us, promised to us. In other words, the promise of Eretz Yisrael and the Torah and the mitzvah of Eretz Yisrael and Torah go together. And how are we supposed to know when it's promised? In other words, when does Hashem want us to be there? When is He giving it to us, so to speak? When we're able to make the mitzvahs, that's what He wants us, and that's a siman that at that point in time it's being given to us. That's the second side, to understand just the basics for Rabbenu Chaim. And the third way to explain the basics for Rabbenu Chaim, and some people learn like this, but I don't think it's compelling, is that Rabbenu Chaim holds the whole mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael is because of the mitzvah tluyas ba'aretz, and therefore if we're not able to mekayim, then there is no mitzvah. So that's dealing with the basic svara of Rabbenu Chaim. Why is the mitzvah tluyas ba'aretz? Why does the challenge of the mitzvah tluyas ba'aretz mevatel? Why does it negate the mitzvah? Either because the mitzvah is dependent, since the mitzvahs tluyas ba'aretz are about the aretz. The mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael is dependent on them. Or the havtacha of Eretz Yisrael, the gift of Eretz Yisrael, is dependent on our ability, on our being mekayim them, or on our ability to mekayim them. Or Rabbenu Chaim holds the whole mitzvah itself is only, the whole mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael is due to the ability that it gives us to do the mitzvah tluyas ba'aretz. If we're not going to do the mitzvah tluyas ba'aretz, then there is no mitzvah to live there. Those are the three ways to learn the basic logic of Rabbenu Chaim Kohen. Now let's get to the question of the Marit. Fact the Marit. What does Rabbenu Chaim mean when he says "Ein anu cholim"? Why not? Why can't we mekayim mitzvah tluyas ba'aretz? Of course we can. It's like Marit. So Marit looks around and says, "I can do it. We can do the mitzvahs. Nothing's stopping us. We can learn the halachas. We can do the mitzvahs." What does Rabbenu Chaim mean? So I want to tell you 4 possibilities to explain Rabbenu Chaim. 3 of them we're going to discuss today, and one of them we're going to leave for the next year. One way of understanding Rabbenu Chaim, and there were people who understood him this way, was that he was talking about Bismanoi. Bismanoi in the 12th century, it was the middle of these crusades, then the Second Crusade. He lived by the Second Crusade, and Eretz Yisrael was a very dangerous place, and the Yidden were very limited in terms of what they could do in Eretz Yisrael. So, firstly, there was a very specific limitation on what we are capable of doing. B'mitzias, that's Chelik Aleph, why Rabbenu Chaim might mean that dafka in his time, and also Rabbenu Chaim might mean dafka in his time because the halachas, and this is also something that's said by the Achronim, the halachas about it weren't fully developed. The sugyas of Zoroim were not being studied for a very long time, and therefore there were a lot of sveikas in halacha, a lot of machlekes that weren't muchra, that weren't decided yet, and a lot of ignorance about the mitzvah tluyas ba'aretz because it wasn't dealt with and worked out. Of course, the Yerushalmi and Zohar is very difficult, etc., all those problems. till we had the Rashi Uleo and the Pasa Shulchan and everyone else and the Rash and Zoroim, till those people did the work to work out Zoroim and to make it clear for us, of course, the Haznation and so on and so forth, till today. Till then, Rabbenu Chaim is saying, look, the fact is we don't have enough idea. It's like, imagine if someone would drop you today in a situation where we have to be Mekayim Tyrus. You just literally wouldn't be able to because you need the study, you need to work out the sugyas, you need to get comfortable with it, you need to get familiar with it. And people have to get familiar with it in general. It has to become a subject of limud in a relevant way. Until that happens, it's going to be very difficult and almost impossible to be Mekayim. So, first, Teretz Marit's question. Marit asks a question, why does Rabbenu Chaim say it's impossible in Yeruchalim? I think it is possible. First answer is, Rabbenu Chaim means Bizmanoi. Bizmanoi was impossible due to the Mitzvos and due to the state of the halachic development of Zorah. That's one side. Second side, to answer the Marit's question. Marit says, I don't understand, I could keep Zorah. I keep Zorah. The answer is, yeah, the Marit could keep Zorah. But the Klal Yisrael in general, is not at the level that they're able to be Nizar. And maybe Rabbenu Chaim understands that there's no mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael if the Klal is not at the level that they're able to do the mitzvahs because they're not on the madrega that they're able to be Nizar in these very difficult mitzvahs. Very difficult to give away a lot of your crop. In fact, the Kuzi, by the way, talks about it. It says it's so difficult to do this. The king said to the Kuzi, it's so difficult to keep all these mitzvahs. And the Kuzi said, yeah, with the shechina is in your presence, it's not. Okay, so if the shechina is in your presence, it's not. But when the shechina is not in our presence, it's very, very difficult to keep all these mitzvahs. It's a great expense. And Rabbenu Chaim might not mean that Rabbenu Chaim can't do it, and you, the Marit, can't do it. Of course we could do it. But we, the people, meaning the Hamoin Am, is not able to be Nizar. And there's no mitzvah. Maybe Rabbenu Chaim understands there's no mitzvah, there's no formal mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael if the nation as a whole is not on the madrega that they're able to be Nizar in the mitzvah to his. And that's a very strong svara. And then, of course, actually history bears this out because there's a lot of Yidden living in Eretz Yisrael today who unfortunately are not being Mekayim Mitzvos Ba'aretz. And for many Yidden for whom it poses a great challenge and they don't pass that challenge. They don't pass that nisayon. So in that sense, Rabbenu Chaim has been proven right. If Rabbenu Chaim means that we, the people as a whole, are not able to be Nizar. That's another answer from Marit's question of what does Rabbenu Chaim mean? How could you say we can't be Nizar? Of course we could. Third answer is, and this is something I'm going to develop and talk about in the next year, but I just want to bring it forth now, but mention it briefly. Rabbenu Chaim might mean that if we study the history of Klal Yisrael and understand the reasons for Galus, we will find, this is mixed in many midrashim, we will find that the Avera of Maisis and the Avera of Mitzvah to his parts in general led to the Galus. Which perhaps Rabbenu Chaim means tells us something about when we're supposed to go back. If it's our not being careful about the Mitzvah to his parts led to the Galus, then we as a people, it's not about individuals, are not supposed to go back until something has changed in us. Until we can say, now we're different. Now we are going to do the Mitzvah to his parts. This is a very deep idea that I'm going to discuss in the next year. We can find a lot of support for this mahalach in Midrashim. And this is also perhaps something Rabbenu Chaim Kohen means. So again, we're answering Marit's question. Rabbenu Chaim says we're not able to be Nizar. And Marit jumps on him and others and say, why not? Of course we can. And I think they're not realizing that, again, either Rabbenu Chaim means B'shaita. Okay, fine. Or Rabbenu Chaim is talking much broadly. He's not talking about tzaddikim and talmidei chacham that are talking to each other. He's talking about the people. The people as a whole are not going to be Nizar. Or thirdly, he means, I understand the mahalach of history, I understand the midrash that say we went to Galus because of Bittul Maisris, and therefore we're not supposed to go back. There's no mitzvah for us to come back until we fix that problem. And again, then he doesn't mean an observation, I look around and we're not able to be Nizar. He means the people as a whole have this problem, and they still have this problem, and they shouldn't just go to Eretz Yisrael and pretend they don't have this problem. They have to first work out this problem. And this is this idea we're going to explore in depth next week. Next year. It's going to be a week off now. Fourth mahalach to explain Rabbenu Chaim and to answer the Marit's question, why can't we be Mekayim the mitzvahs? There's a very fascinating passage in the Kuzri where the Kuzr king, he's basically arguing that the people of Bayis Sheni, when they came back to Bayis Sheni, they must have been Amarats. They must have been ignorant, because the pasuk talks about they found something in the Torah. It sounds like they didn't know a basic halachah. And the Chaver proves to him that they must have been very great in their Torah knowledge, because the Chaver says to the Kuzr king, he says, this is in the source sheet number 6, he said, if we today were all suddenly obligated to bring a carbon, would we know how to slaughter it? Where, how to accept the blood, how to skin it, how to cut it, how many limbs to cut it, how to be makriv it, how to throw the blood. And the Kuzr says, yeah, we don't know it. And yet the Chaver continues, look, in the Bayis Sheni they were able to do the avodah, see that they had much more detailed knowledge of the Torah than we do. So the Chaver says that if we today would have to bring a carbon, we wouldn't be able to do it. Now, what does he mean? Why not? We have the whole Masechtas, we have the whole Seder Kodshim. Why can't we bring a carbon? Why can't we figure out from the books how to bring a carbon? What Yehuda Levi is saying is a very, very important idea. That you have a dead letter, you have books that are not lived by, you have laws that were in disuse for 1,000 years. You can't just resurrect the practice by reading books. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. And this is something that people don't realize so much. You think, okay, halachah is about books. Read the book, you do it. No, but there's machlekes in. There's things that are not captured by by the written word. And the only way, Yehuda Levi is suggesting, it seems to be saying, the only way to keep a halacha clear, to keep a body of halacha clear and make sure it's well known and understood, is if it's being practiced. But if it gets into disuse for a long time, then you need, as he says, a kohen or a navi. It means you don't need a nevuah to bring it back, but you need some sort of siyata d'shmaya to be able to bring it back in the correct way. So perhaps that's what Rabbenu Chaim means. Means, look, Zohar has been in disuse for 1,000 years, hasn't been practiced, well, from the perspective of the Ba'ataisis anyways, and we're not going to be able to put it back together correctly and accurately just from the books. Maybe that's what he means. Now, this gets to a whole set of questions about, like, how much do we have to get to the truth in halacha? Why can't we decide halacha questions based on the way we decide everything? Which I'm not going to go into. But it's possible this is what Rabbenu Chaim means. And it's very interesting. The Chazon Ish actually says in Demai that he says a fascinating thing. Quote, Ein anu betuchim shelo avarnu b'chol hashonim al echad mehadvarim hama'akvam mesavidui. He's talking about whether there's a mitzvah to say vidui maisis b'zan hazeh, which means you're supposed to declare that you did everything right. He says, we're not sure that we didn't transgress over the years one of the things that are ma'akev vidui. He seems to be saying that we can never be sure. What he means is, I think what he means is that b'zman hazeh, our grasp on Zroim, with all the work that the Chazon Ish, of course, himself and others put in, still doesn't give us bitachon, still doesn't give us certainty. So that's the fourth mahalach that Rabbenu Chaim is perhaps saying. So again, let's review the four possibilities, and then we're going to discuss where this takes us, and whether he said it bismanai, whether he said it for today, and what the halach is. Again, Rabbenu Chaim links the mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael with the ability to mekayim mitzvahs ba'aretz, and he says we're unable. Frek marit, we are able, and then we have four answers. Rabbenu Chaim was talking about b'shaitoi. B'shaitoi was unable. Second answer, Rabbenu Chaim means we, the people as a whole, are unable because the masses are not going to live up to this great challenge. This is a very, very imposing challenge, very difficult challenge. 3, Rabbenu Chaim means, and this is what we're going to discuss at length next year. 3, Rabbenu Chaim means we exiled, we went to Golos for not doing the mitzvah tluyas ba'aretz. We're not welcome to go back until we worked out that problem. And 4, Rabbenu Chaim means a dead letter, a law that was just on the books and wasn't being fulfilled, is not amenable to being resurrected properly, and therefore we lost the Messiah, as it were. We could say we lost the Messiah on Zraim, and we're not able to mekayim it. Now, I just want to tell you the fourth point. Also, you could say is also only b'shaitai. Perhaps once the Rambam did his work on Zraim, and everyone afterwards, perhaps they indicated that they were able to bring it back, and maybe they had the siyata d'shmaya because you see that this is such amazing work. So you could say it is b'siyua lucky, and now we do have Zraim back. That's all possible within the fourth idea. But just to explain what he means, and to defend him from the charge of the Marit and others who say they don't know what he's talking about. Why can't you mekayim Zraim? So for that we have four explanations. All of them, to my opinion, are good explanations for Rabbenu Chaim is about. Like I said, the third one is going to be treated more in the next year. Okay, now I'm going to tell you some sources. There are, in fact, some Achronim who said, many Achronim, that said Rabbenu Chaim was talking about B'shaitoi. That we have the Chidah. The Chidah says that B'zman Rabbenu Chaim Kohen, everything was still a suffix, and the people who were living in Eretz Yisrael were nichshal. In terumos, they were even nichshal in the question of what year to keep shemittah, because what year to keep shemittah wasn't yet determined. There was machlokes about it, and he says people come to Eretz Yisrael the nichshal because they don't know. But now it was already established, and it was already determined, and now it's something that says the Chidah that now we could all be mekayim to his part. So Rabbenu Chaim's psak is not relevant anymore. See, Rabbenu Chaim said achshav ein mitzvah. So the Chidah achshav means in his time. Similarly, we have the Netziv says that in a Askamata Seif called the Mansini, he says Bizmanam they weren't able to, but now we are able to be Nizer Yafa Yafa. It's very difficult, it's challenging, but doesn't mean it should stop us from going. And that's Takab Shalom Zalman says it's also in the Tshuva Bizmanenu the Efshe Shapeh Lishma L'Kaim Shapach Yom L'Alis Gam Rabbenu Chaim Kohen. So very important. If you want to take Rabbenu Chaim Kohen halachah, it's bichlal not clear that Rabbenu Chaim Kohen said Bizman Hazeh. He said Achshav, and if you look in the context of Taisus over there in Ksubas Daf Kuf Yud, the beginning of Taisus talks about that it's dangerous to go to Eretz Yisrael, so therefore there's no mitzvah. Of course, that only means at a certain point in time, and Taisus' point in time doesn't mean as a rule. So therefore, Rabbenu Chaim's Achshav also could be, he's observing something about his time. In his time, it was very difficult to be Mekayim because they didn't know the halachah, or like I said, because the reality of Mitzvos, and that doesn't apply today. And this is what many Achronim say. Now, let's talk about the second question. So remember, we have three questions on Rabbenu Chaim Kohen. What does he mean? We dealt with that. Whether he's referring to his time or all time, is very, very strong reason to say he's referring to his time, but depending on how you explain what he means. And now I want to get to the third question of whether the halachah is like Rabbenu Chaim Kohen, just as a purely halachic matter. Remember, I still have to explain the third mahalach of Rabbenu Chaim Kohen, which has a lot of basis in the Midrashim, that if we went to Galus because of Maasros, we can't just go back to Eretz Yisrael without working out that problem. That's what we're going to get to next year. But let's talk about the question, okay, we have the sheet of Rabbenu Chaim, which may or may not mean B'zman Hazeh. One question is, does he even mean B'zman Hazeh? And many people, great people, argue that he doesn't. And indeed, if Allah will be right in a certain sense, meaning Rabbenu Chaim Kohen said something about his time, it doesn't mean he's referring to this time. So anyone that says Rabbenu Chaim says there's no mitzvah, it's not necessarily true. Rabbenu Chaim might not have said that, and there's reason to believe he only meant it for his time. But let's say he did mean it. For now, is that the halachah? Is the halachah like Rabbenu Chaim? So I want to tell you some achronim. The Pischei Tshuva in Eben Ezer Siman Ayin Hey says Kol HaPoskim Yishanim Achronim. He shows Lo Yisviru Luhad Rabbenu Chaim Kohen, and the Pasach Shulchan, the great Sefer on Eretz Yisrael, quotes the Shiloh as Decha'oi. The Shiloh is Deicha the Shita the Chidahi V'Le Mistaber Taimei Ve'en Lashgiach Olav. It's a Das Yochid and it's not Mistaber Ve'en Lashgiach Olav. Pay no attention to it. Okay, so. So let's summarize what we have today. We have the Shita of Rabbenu Chaim Kohen, which we explained in the four ways. The third way about the fact that we exile due to Mitzvos, and therefore we're not supposed to go back until we work out the problem, is what we're going to get to in the next year. But before we get there, we could talk about Rabbenu Chaim Kohen, and this is what we did speak about, just to summarize, Rabbenu Chaim Shita from a formal halachic perspective. Is there a sheet of a Rishon, of a great Rishon, that says there's no mitzvah b'zman hazeh? So again, he may have only said it b'shaitai, which is very reasonable. He said it in his time. And even if he does mean it for b'zman hazeh, it's a das yochid and it's nidcha lahalacha. It's nidcha mehalacha. Now, I want to add to this discussion about the halacha of Rabbenu Chaim Kohen two very, very important nekudas. Nakuda number one, if someone says, I hold like Rabbenu Chaim Kohen, and therefore there's no mitzvah to live in Eretz Yisrael because Einu Yichel Mizoyer in the mitzvahs and the Insurmountable ba'aretz, that person shouldn't eat or drink Israeli produce, like Israeli wine and other fruits that come from Eretz Yisrael. Mostly wine, people consume Israeli wine. Because the same argument that, Einu Yichel Mizoyer says no mitzvah, you shouldn't rely on the fact that they're being nizar properly, the mitzvah to Yisbar, Shvias, and Tafel, and Maisus, and Orla. For drinking Israeli produce, which no one does today. Unless someone will argue, no. I hold Rabbenu Chaim Kohen doesn't mean for me. I am able to be nizar, because I buy good hechsher. Rabbenu Chaim Kohen means like that other tzad, that the klal can't be nizar. Okay. The point is that's a hashara. And I'm talking about formally, in a formal halachic question, to apply Rabbenu Chaim Kohen as a halachic shita, while at the same time someone is drinking wine from Eretz Yisrael is a shvet. To make a hashara, say, I hold Rabbenu Chaim Kohen means for the klal. The klal can't be nizar, so therefore there's no mitzvah. I can still drink Israeli wine because I'm careful. It's all hasharas gedolos, which is not how one makes halacha. You can't be saying that halacha l'maisa. Second point is, so therefore basically, if someone were to be consistent, say he actually holds Rabbenu Chaim Kohen, I would like to know, and that's why he doesn't live in Eretz Yisrael, I'd like to explain, I'd like to understand why, or does he drink or eat Israeli food? Because he shouldn't. And if he goes to Eretz Yisrael, he should, if he visits Eretz Yisrael, he should take along Yevol Chutzlaretz, if he really holds like Rabbenu Chaim Kohen, B'zman Hazeh. That's one argument. The second thing to know is a very important point, and this solves the second point, meaning if Rabbenu Chaim Taka means for the klal. In other words, like I was saying, the guy will say, I could eat Israeli food because I'm careful, but the olam as a whole is not holding by being careful of mice, and therefore there's no mitzvah, because there's no mitzvah if the nation is not holding by, which is a very nice svar. But then there's a very important point, because if Rabbenu Chaim is talking about a certain sakana ruchnis that there is to the nation by being in Eretz Yisrael and not being mekayim mitzvahs ba'aretz. The fact is we cannot ignore that today there's a bigger sakana ruchnis for people, those people who are not trusted to do terumos and mitzvahs in Eretz Yisrael. There's a bigger sakana ruchnis for them to be in Chutz La'aretz, because intermarriage happens at a much greater rate, obviously, in Chutz La'aretz than it happens in Eretz Yisrael. What keeps the people who are not so committed, what keeps them part of the Klal Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael, is that they're living in Eretz Yisrael and they're living among Jews. So if Rabbenu Chaim Kohen means the nation as a whole shouldn't be exposed to this sakana of terumos and mitzvahs, and therefore we say, the nation as a whole shouldn't be in Eretz Yisrael. Once today we have the situation where the nation as a whole is falling away to intermarriage, then the argument that they shouldn't be in Eretz Yisrael because of the spiritual dangers of being there as a nation as a whole become completely l'chayr batel. Again, you could argue, say, no, mitzvah tluyas ba'aretz are kivei the mitzvah zaretz. Intermarriage is a zayte gezach. But this is all, like I said before, these kinds of things don't work. Halachah. The Maisa, as a halachic matter, Rabbenu Chaim Kohen's shita is not nidche. What we're going to get to the next year, though, is that the third tzad to explain Rabbenu Chaim Kohen is very, very interesting and has a lot of basis in the Midrashim. The idea is basically that, I'm going to show you this in the next year, that we went to Golos because of mitzvah tluyas ba'aretz, specifically because not taking maasros, and therefore we're not just to just waltz right back in without dealing with that problem, without figuring out how is it going to be different. That's what I'm going to show you for some Midrashim. It starts in the days of Bayis Sheni. The Golos Rishon, the Golos to Bavel happened because of not being careful in maasros. And the going back to Eretz Yisrael after Golos Bavel, they did something at that time to deal with the maasros problem. And otherwise, maybe they shouldn't go back. We're going to see in the Midrashim. That might be a source for Rabbenu Chaim Kohen. That's the third way to explain Rabbenu Chaim Kohen in a deeper way. And even if it's not the Pshat of Rabbenu Chaim Kohen, we have to go through these Midrashim and see, what does this tell us? Is there actually a source for this idea that we don't belong in Eretz Yisrael because of Bittul Maasros, neither do we belong coming back into Eretz Yisrael? That is going to be the next year, which is going to take place not next week, but the week after. Now there's going to be a week off until next time.